They say that royalty is written in the blood, that it carries a divine right to rule, a sacred protection granted by God himself. But on a cold May morning in 1541, within the grim stone walls of the Tower of London, royalty offered no protection. It only offered a target. Standing on the wooden scaffold was not a traitor, nor a spy, nor a criminal mastermind. It was a fragile, grey-haired woman of 67 years, Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury. She was the last of the Plantagenets, the final living relic of a dynasty that had ruled England for centuries. In her veins flowed the blood of kings, the same blood that had won Agincourt and built the very tower she now stood upon. But to the man sitting on the throne, King Henry VIII, her blood was not a gift. It was a poison. It was a threat that had to be erased. The executioner waiting for her was not the usual professional headsman. History tells us the regular executioner was away, perhaps busy in the north. In his place stood a wretched and blundering youth, a boy who had likely never severed a human neck in his life. He held the heavy axe in trembling hands, the iron cold against the morning mist. Usually the condemned accept their fate. They kneel, they pray, they offer a coin to the executioner and ask for a clean strike. It is a ritual of order. But Margaret Pole was not a woman of order. She was a woman of defiance. When told to lay her head upon the block, she refused. She stood tall, her eyes blazing with the pride of 100 ancestors. "So should traitors do," she reportedly said, her voice echoing off the White Tower, "and I am none." What happened next was not an execution. It was a massacre. A scene so chaotic, so brutal, and so utterly devoid of dignity that it shocked even the blood-soaked sensibilities of Tudor England. The executioner had to chase the elderly Countess around the scaffold, swinging the axe wildly, hacking at her shoulders and head as she refused to yield. It was a butchery that turned the consecrated ground of the Tower into a slaughterhouse. But how did it come to this? How did the most noble woman in England, a woman who had once been the governess to the king's own daughter, end up being hunted down like an animal on a wooden stage? What if I told you that Margaret Pole died not for what she did, but simply for who she was? Her story is one of the most tragic weaving of fate, loyalty, and madness in history. It is the story of a woman who survived the destruction of her entire family, who rose from the ashes to become one of the wealthiest figures in the land, only to be destroyed by the paranoia of a tyrant who saw monsters in the shadows. To understand the horror of her death, we must first understand the dangerous burden of her birth, and we must go back to a time when the name Plantagenet was not a death sentence, but the definition of glory. Margaret was born in August 1473 at Farleigh, Hungerford Castle. She was born into a world of gold and velvet, the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, and the niece of two kings, Edward IV and the infamous Richard III. If you look at her family tree, you don't see names, you see legends. She was the White Rose of York. Her earliest memories were of a kingdom at war with itself. This was the height of the Wars of the Roses, a decades-long family feud that turned England into a battlefield. But inside the nursery, life seemed secure. She was a princess in all but name. She had a younger brother, Edward, whom she adored. They were the golden children of the House of York, destined for greatness. But the curse of her life was that the men around her did not die in their beds. The first trauma, the first crack in the foundation of her world, came when she was just a small child. Her mother died shortly after giving birth, leaving Margaret and Edward alone with their father. George, Duke of Clarence, was a man of charm, but also of reckless ambition. He played a dangerous game against his own brother, King Edward IV. And in the ruthless mathematics of power, brotherhood equals 0. When Margaret was barely 5 years old, her father was arrested for treason. The king, her own uncle, ordered the execution. But it wasn't a standard beheading. The legends say that George was privately executed in the Tower of London, drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. Imagine a 5-year-old girl trying to understand that. Her father didn't just die, he was swallowed by the very luxury he loved. He was erased. With his death, the golden life vanished. Margaret and her brother Edward were declared illegitimate. Their vast lands were seized. They went from being royalty to being orphans, living on the charity of the crown. It was a lesson Margaret learned early, and one she would carry to her grave. Favor is missed, but power is iron. And power can take everything away in the blink of an eye. Yet as long as the House of York held the throne, she was safe. Her uncle, King Edward IV, died, and her other uncle, Richard III, took the crown. History paints Richard as a villain, the man who murdered the princes in the Tower, but to Margaret, he was family. He was the shield that kept the wolves at bay. Then came the year 1485, the Battle of Bosworth Field. It is a date etched in blood in English history. Richard III rode out to meet a challenger from across the sea, a man with a tenuous claim to the throne named Henry Tudor. When Richard fell in the mud, his skull crushed, the Plantagenet dynasty died with him. The medieval world ended, and the Tudor age began. For 12-year-old Margaret, this was the catastrophe. The Tudors were the enemy. They were the Red Rose. And now Henry VII was king. Henry VII was a man of cold calculation. He knew his claim to the throne was weak. He knew that as long as there were legitimate Plantagenet heirs alive, his crown would never be secure. He looked at Margaret and her brother Edward, and he didn't see children. He saw loose ends. Margaret was a girl, so she was considered less dangerous. But her brother Edward, the Earl of Warwick, he was a boy. He could lead an army. He could take the throne. So Henry VII did something monstrous. He took the 10-year-old boy and locked him in the Tower of London. Edward would spend the rest of his life in the dark. He grew up in solitary confinement, cut off from the world, from education, from love. Chroniclers say that by the time he was a young man, he was so innocent and unworldly that he could not discern a goose from a capon. He was a child in a man's body, broken by silence. Margaret was on the outside, helpless. She had to watch from a distance as her brother rotted in prison. She learned the art of silence. She learned to lower her head, to make herself small, to be invisible. She was married off to a staunch Tudor loyalist, Sir Richard Pole. It was a strategic marriage, designed to neutralize her. Richard Pole was a safe man, a cousin of the king, not wealthy, not powerful. By marrying her to him, the king ensured she would live a quiet life of domestic obscurity. And for a while, she did. She bore children. She managed a household. She buried her Plantagenet pride deep inside her heart, under layers of Tudor obedience. But the tragedy of her brother was not over. In 1499, a pretender named Perkin Warbeck tried to claim the throne. King Henry VII needed to secure a marriage alliance with Spain for his son, Arthur. The Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, were ruthless. They told Henry they would not send their daughter, Catherine of Aragon, to a country where a rival claimant to the throne still lived. They were talking about Edward, the boy in the Tower. To buy a Spanish bride, Henry VII paid with innocent blood. He ordered the execution of Margaret's brother. Edward was 24 years old, but in his mind he was still 10. He was dragged out of the darkness he had lived in for 14 years and beheaded on Tower Hill. He had committed no crime. He had plotted no treason. His only crime was his last name. Margaret was 26. She had lost her father to a barrel of wine and her brother to a political marriage contract. She was now truly the last leaf on a dead tree. The grief must have been suffocating. But Margaret Pole did not scream. She did not rail against the injustice. She understood the rules of the game now. To speak was to die. To survive, she had to be useful. And strangely, fate offered her a hand. With the arrival of Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess for whom her brother had been sacrificed, Margaret found a place at court. Catherine was kind, pious, and guilt-ridden. She knew that her marriage had been bought with the blood of Margaret's brother. Perhaps out of penance, or perhaps out of genuine affection, Catherine took Margaret under her wing. Margaret became a lady-in-waiting to the new Princess of Wales. And when Prince Arthur died suddenly, and Catherine eventually married his younger brother, the charismatic, athletic, golden-haired Henry VIII, Margaret was there. For the first time in decades, the sun seemed to shine on Margaret Pole. Henry VIII, young and confident, wanted to heal the wounds of the past. He wanted to show that he was king of all England, York and Lancaster alike. He looked at Margaret, his mother's cousin, and saw a dignified, pious woman who had suffered enough. He did something extraordinary. He restored her lands. He gave her back the title that had been stripped from her family. He made her the Countess of Salisbury in her own right. Overnight, Margaret went from a quiet widow to one of the 5 wealthiest peers in England. She had castles, vast estates, and an income that rivaled the greatest dukes. She was in her 40s, a time when most women of her era were fading into the background, and she was ascending to the peak of power. She became the governess to the king's daughter, Princess Mary. She was the matriarch of the court, respected, feared, and immensely powerful. She had 4 sons, and she began to position them in high places. Her son, Reginald Pole, was a brilliant scholar, a favorite of the king, paid for by the king's own purse to study in Italy. It seemed that the curse of the Plantagenets had finally been broken. Margaret had played the long game, and she had won. She had survived the wars, the executions, the poverty, and the suspicion. She had rebuilt her house from the rubble, but there is a cruel irony in the history of the Tudor court. The higher you rise, the further you fall, and the ground beneath Margaret's feet was about to shift again. The young King Henry, the generous boy who had restored her, was changing. The athletic prince was becoming a paranoid tyrant. His obsession with a male heir, his infatuation with a woman named Anne Boleyn, and his desire to break with the Catholic Church were creating a storm that would tear England apart. Margaret Pole was a woman of the old world. She was devoutly Catholic. She was loyal to Queen Catherine of Aragon. She was a Plantagenet. She stood for everything Henry was about to destroy. And far away in Italy, her son Reginald was about to make a decision that would sign his mother's death warrant. He was about to write a book that would insult the king, a book that would turn Henry's love for the Pole family into a hatred so burning, so irrational, that it would consume them all. The golden autumn of Margaret Pole was ending. The winter was coming, and this time there would be no survival. The 1520s were the Indian summer of Margaret Pole's life. To look at her then was to see the very definition of matriarchal power. She was no longer the frightened orphan of the Tower. She was the Countess of Salisbury, a woman of immense dignity and staggering wealth. She owned lands in 17 different counties. She had 4 grand manor houses, a personal staff of hundreds, and a retinue that rivaled the king's own. She was the rock upon which the old feudal order rested. While the new men of the court, the butcher's sons like Cardinal Wolsey and the blacksmith's sons like Thomas Cromwell, clawed their way up with ink and ambition, Margaret sat secure in her ancient blood. She was a Plantagenet. She didn't need to climb. She simply was. Her greatest honor, however, was not her land, but her charge. King Henry trusted her with his most precious possession, his daughter, Princess Mary. Margaret was appointed the princess's state governess. It was more than a job. It was a bond of the soul. Margaret became a second mother to the girl. She managed Mary's household, oversaw her education, and guided her spiritual life. Imagine the scene at Ludlow Castle. where they held court. Margaret, the silver-haired survivor of the Wars of the Roses, teaching the young Tudor princess the duties of royalty. There was a profound symmetry to it. The white rose nurturing the red rose. It seemed that the wounds of the past had finally healed. But history is a circle, and the wheel was about to turn. The trouble began with a whisper that grew into a roar. The king wanted a son. Queen Catherine had only given him a daughter, Mary. Henry, driven by anxiety and lust, convinced himself that his marriage was cursed by God. He wanted an annulment. He wanted Anne Boleyn. This was the forbidden element that would tear Margaret's life apart. The king demanded absolute loyalty, not just to his crown, but to his desires. He required every noble in England to agree that his marriage to Catherine was a sham, a sin. Margaret Pole could not do it. She was a woman of iron principles. She loved Queen Catherine. She adored Princess Mary. To accept the annulment was to declare Mary a bastard. It was to spit on the sanctity of marriage and the authority of the Pope. Margaret was not a rebel by nature. She was a traditionalist. But in a world that was rapidly turning upside down, tradition became rebellion. The conflict started quietly. When Henry banished Catherine from court, Margaret continued to serve Princess Mary. But as Henry stripped Mary of her title, demanding she be called merely the Lady Mary, Margaret refused to hand over the princess's jewels and plate. She fought for the girl's dignity with the ferocity of a lioness. Henry was furious. In 1533, he struck the first blow. He discharged Margaret from her post. He tore her away from the girl she had raised, banishing her from Mary's household. It was a heartbreak for both of them. Mary, sick and terrified, begged to see her governess. Margaret, defying the king's implicit warnings, offered to serve Mary at her own expense, with her own servants. Henry refused. "I will not have that woman near my daughter," he might as well have said. He knew that Margaret stiffened Mary's resolve. He knew that Margaret was the backbone of the resistance. Margaret retreated to her estates. She tried to be invisible again. She tried to play the harmless old woman card that had saved her life under Henry VII. But the 1530s were different. The Reformation had begun. Monasteries were being dissolved. The old religion was under attack. And the Pole family, devout, royal, and influential, became a lightning rod for everyone who hated the changes. And then, the spark that would ignite the powder keg arrived. It didn't come from Margaret. It came from her son, Reginald Pole. Reginald was Margaret's pride and joy. He was brilliant, charismatic, and deeply intellectual. King Henry had loved him. The king had paid for Reginald's education at Oxford and Padua, grooming him for high office in the church. Henry believed Reginald was his man. When the divorce crisis hit, Henry expected Reginald to use his brilliant mind to write a defense of the king's actions. He expected Reginald to convince the crowned heads of Europe that Henry was right. Henry waited for the manuscript. He waited for the loyalty he had paid for. Instead, in 1536, from the safety of Italy, Reginald Pole sent the king a book titled Pro Ecclesiastica Unitatis Defensione, in defense of the unity of the church. It was a suicide note written in Latin. Reginald didn't just disagree with the king, he annihilated him. He compared Henry to the biblical tyrants. He called Anne Boleyn a whore. He attacked the king's claim to be supreme head of the church. He urged the Emperor Charles V to invade England and depose Henry. It was pure, unadulterated treason. Imagine the scene when Henry VIII received this book. The king, growing fatter and more volatile by the day, sitting in his privy chamber, expecting praise from his protégé. As he read the pages, his face likely turned that terrifying shade of purple that his courtiers learned to fear. This was the ultimate betrayal. The boy he had sponsored, the cousin he had loved, had spat in his face in front of all of Europe. Henry's rage was apoplectic, but there was a problem. Reginald was in Italy. He was out of reach. He was protected by the Pope, who soon made him a cardinal, a prince of the church, which only enraged Henry further. If you cannot strike the man who hurt you, you strike what he loves. Henry looked at the map of England. He looked at the vast estates of the Pole family. He looked at Margaret. "He shall eat his heart out," Henry reportedly said of Reginald. And he meant it. He would make Reginald watch from afar as his family was devoured piece by piece. At first, the pressure was subtle. Cromwell, the king's ruthless enforcer, began to investigate the family. They found evidence, flimsy, ridiculous evidence, that the Poles were plotting a rebellion. They called it the Exeter Conspiracy. The theory was that the Pole family and their allies, the Courtenays, were planning to overthrow Henry and place Margaret's eldest son, Henry Lord Montague, on the throne. It was almost certainly a fabrication. Margaret was over 60. She was tired. She wasn't plotting invasions. She was managing her sheep and her tenants. But in the paranoid mind of Henry VIII, innocence was no defense. The mere fact that they could rebel meant they would rebel. In 1538, the trap snapped shut. Margaret was at her manor in Warblington, living her quiet, luxurious life, when the king's commissioners arrived. They didn't knock politely. They swarmed the house. They interrogated her servants for hours, twisting every innocent remark into treason. They found nothing of substance, no stockpiles of weapons, no secret letters to Reginald. The only thing they found was a tunic, a piece of white silk embroidered with the 5 wounds of Christ, a symbol associated with the Catholic rebels of the North. To a rational mind, it was a religious garment. To Cromwell, it was a flag of war. They arrested her sons first. Henry Lord Montague and her younger son Geoffrey were thrown into the Tower. Then they came for her. The interrogation of Margaret Pole is a testament to her spirit. She was an elderly woman, facing the most terrifying men in England, men who had sent queens and cardinals to the block. But she did not crack. The Earl of Southampton, who led the interrogation, wrote to Cromwell in frustration. He said he had never seen a woman so like a man. He meant it as an insult, but it was the highest praise. She was steadfast. She admitted nothing because there was nothing to admit. She was innocent. But innocence was irrelevant. The king wanted blood. In November 1538, she was arrested and taken to Cowdray House, and later to the Tower of London. The transformation was brutal. She went from the mistress of vast estates to a prisoner in a cold stone room. The king stripped her of everything, her titles, her lands, her wealth. The Countess of Salisbury ceased to exist. She was just Margaret Pole, traitor. The final blow to her heart came not from the king, but from her own blood. Her younger son, Geoffrey, broke under torture. Terrified of the rack, terrified of death, he told the interrogators what they wanted to hear. He implicated his brother, Montague. He implicated his family. He sold his own flesh and blood to save his neck. In December 1538, based on Geoffrey's forced confession, Henry Lord Montague was beheaded on Tower Hill. Margaret had now lost her father, her brother, and her eldest son to the executioner's axe. She was alone in the Tower. The winter of 1539 was bitter. The king, in a display of petty cruelty, refused to pay for her clothing or heating. The woman who had once owned 17 manors was reduced to shivering in rags. She had no warm cloak. Her shoes were worn through, but still, she refused to confess. She carved a message into the stone wall of her cell: "For traitors on the block should die. I am no traitor. No, not I. My faithfulness stands fast, and so, towards the block, I shall not go." It was a promise of defiance. For 2 years, she languished there. 2 years of silence, 2 years of cold. Henry seemed to have forgotten her. He had taken her money, killed her son, and locked her away. Perhaps he would let her die of old age. But in 1541, the north of England rose in rebellion again. It had nothing to do with Margaret. She was an old woman locked in a tower hundreds of miles away. But the rebellion panicked the king. He felt his throne shaking. He needed to send a message. He needed to clear the board of any potential rivals. He remembered the old woman in the tower, the last Plantagenet, the mother of the man who hated him. And so, on that fateful morning in May, without a trial, without a sentence, and with only an hour's notice, the constable of the tower knocked on her door. "Come, my lady," he said. "It is time." Margaret looked at him, confused. She had not been judged. She had not been condemned. "Time for what?" she asked. "To die." The rise was over. The forbidden loyalty had cost her everything. Now only the agony remained. It is a peculiar kind of horror to be erased while you are still alive, to watch the world continue, to hear the bells of London ringing across the water, knowing that you have already been declared dead by the law, even while your heart still beats. This was the existence of Margaret Pole in the final years of her life. The mechanism of her destruction was not a trial by jury. King Henry VIII and his fixer Thomas Cromwell knew better than to put an elderly, respected and pious woman on a public stand. A jury might pity her. The people might riot. She was too loved, too noble. So they chose a weapon that allowed no defense. The Act of Attainder. This was a legislative murder. It was a bill passed by Parliament declaring a person guilty of treason without the need for a trial, without the need for witnesses, and without the need for the accused to speak a single word in their own defense. It was the ultimate tool of tyranny. If the king said you were guilty, Parliament signed the paper and you were a dead woman walking. To justify this, Cromwell needed a prop. He needed something to wave in front of the House of Lords to prove that this frail grandmother was a dangerous revolutionary. And so he produced the tunic. It was found in her linen chest at her home in Warblington. A white silk tunic embroidered with the 5 wounds of Christ, the bleeding hands, feet and side of Jesus. It was a symbol of Catholic devotion, common in prayer books and altars. But years earlier, during the Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive rebellion against Henry's religious changes, the rebels had marched under this same banner. Cromwell stood before the peers of the realm, men who had dined at Margaret's table, men who knew her character, and he held up the tunic. He claimed it was a military uniform. He claimed Margaret had designed it for her son to wear when he led the invasion of England. It was a lie so transparent, it was almost insults. Margaret Pole was over 60. She was not sewing battle flags. But fear is a powerful blinder. The lords looked at the tunic, they looked at the king's anger, and they voted. The Act of Attainder was passed. Margaret was stripped of her title, her lands, and her humanity. She was now legally a non-person, awaiting the king's pleasure. But the king's pleasure was slow. He didn't execute her immediately. He let her rot. The conditions of her imprisonment in the Tower of London were designed to break her spirit. This was a woman who had lived in palaces, who had slept in beds hung with velvet and gold. Now she was confined to a damp stone cell within the precinct of the fortress where her brother had been murdered 40 years earlier. The Tower was not just a prison, it was a mausoleum of her family. Every shadow held a ghost. The deprivation was absolute. The king, in his vindictiveness, stopped paying for her upkeep. The woman who once commanded an income of thousands of pounds a year was reduced to a state of destitution that would have been pitiable for a beggar, let alone a princess of the blood. We know the extent of her suffering because of a letter that survived. It was written by her jailer, a man named Wyman Carew. Even he, a man paid to keep her locked up, was shocked by her condition. He wrote to the court begging for the basics of survival. He asked for a nightgown, for she had none to keep her warm in the bitter river damp. He asked for shoes, for hers were worn to scraps of leather. He asked for petticoats, for extra sheets. "She hath no change of apparel," he wrote. "She is in great misery." Imagine the scene. The last Plantagenet, the daughter of a duke, shivering in the dark, wrapping thin, threadbare blankets around her freezing shoulders, listening to the wind howl off the Thames. Her son Montague was headless in a grave nearby. Her son Geoffrey was living in shame outside the walls, the man who had betrayed them all. Her son Reginald was a cardinal in Rome, powerless to help her, knowing that every word he wrote against the king only added another stone to his mother's tomb. And yet, she did not die. She did not succumb to pneumonia or despair. There was a core of steel in Margaret Pole that Henry could not break. She spent her days in prayer. She carved her defiance into the walls. She waited. For 2 years, she was a ghost in the machine of the Tudor state. In 1540, the wheel turned again. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of her ruin, fell from grace. The man who had brandished her tunic in Parliament was himself arrested, attainted, and beheaded on Tower Hill. One can only wonder if Margaret heard the cannon fire that announced his death, if she felt a grim satisfaction that the monster had been devoured by his creator. With Cromwell dead, there was a flicker of hope. Perhaps the king's rage would cool. Perhaps he would remember that she was his mother's cousin, his daughter's governess. Perhaps he would simply let her fade away in a convent. But Henry VIII was not a man who forgave. He was a man who festered. He was growing older. His leg was ulcerated and agonizingly painful, and his temper was blacker than ever. He saw conspiracies everywhere. In early 1541, a minor rebellion broke out in Yorkshire, led by a man named Sir John Neville. It was easily crushed, but it terrified the king. It reminded him that his throne was not safe. It reminded him that there were still people in England who preferred the old ways, the old religion, and the old blood. Margaret Pole was the symbol of all three. As long as she breathed, she was a rallying point. She was a living alternative to the Tudor tyranny. The decision was made. It was not a public announcement. There was no date set in the calendar. It was a quiet, administrative order, signed with an irritable scrawl: "Clear the Tower, finish the business." On the morning of May 27, 1541, the sun rose over a quiet London. There were no crowds gathering on Tower Hill. There was no scaffold being built outside the walls for a public spectacle. Usually, the execution of a peer of the realm was a grand, somber event, attended by thousands. But Henry denied Margaret even that dignity. He wanted it done in secret. He wanted it done within the walls, on the small private green near the White Tower. A private slaughter for a private vendetta. Margaret was in her cell, perhaps praying, perhaps eating a meager breakfast. She had no idea that this was her last hour. When the constable of the Tower, Sir John Gage, arrived at her door, the shock was genuine. He told her to prepare herself. He told her she was to die. Margaret looked at him with the confusion of the innocent. "I have not been judged," she said. "I have not been condemned." It was true. She had never stood trial. She had never faced her accusers. To her, the idea that they could simply walk in and kill her was an absurdity, a violation of God's law and man's law. She was not a traitor. She was the Countess of Salisbury. But the constable was not there to debate the law. He was there to obey orders. He told her that the king's will was law, and the king willed her death. There is a terrifying intimacy to what happened next. This wasn't a prisoner walking to a distant scaffold amidst the roar of a crowd. This was an old woman being told in her bedroom that she had to walk a few hundred yards to have her head cut off. She asked to see the warrant. She asked for a priest. The records are hazy on whether she was granted these final mercies, but we know she refused to admit guilt. "I am no traitor," she repeated. She would not validate their murder with her submission. They let her out into the bright May sunlight. The transition must have been blinding after the gloom of the cell. She walked across the green, her step perhaps slow with age, but her back straight. And there, waiting for her, was the final insult. There was no block. In the haste to kill her, or perhaps in a deliberate attempt to degrade her, they had not prepared the proper equipment for a noble execution. Usually, a high-born prisoner would kneel at a proper block, sculpted to fit the neck and shoulders, allowing for a clean, dignified death. Instead, there was a low log, a piece of wood barely raised off the ground, and standing beside it was not the professional executioner of London, a man skilled in the swift art of death. The main headsman had been sent north to deal with the rebels. In his place stood a wretched and blundering youth, a novice, a boy who had been handed a heavy axe and told to do a man's job. Margaret looked at the log. She looked at the terrified boy holding the axe. She looked at the small group of officials who had gathered to witness the end of the Plantagenets. Most victims at this point collapse. They weep. They beg. Margaret Pole did not weep. The blood of kings does not beg. As the reality of the situation settled upon her, a cold fury took hold. She realized that they intended to butcher her like cattle. She turned to the constable. She turned to the executioner, and she made a choice that would echo through history. She would not kneel quietly. She would not make it easy for them. If they wanted her life, they would have to take it. The betrayal was complete. The agony was about to begin. The air on the Tower Green was still. The birds had stopped singing, as if nature itself was holding its breath, unwilling to witness what was about to happen. Margaret Pole stood by the small wooden log that was meant to serve as her deathbed. She looked at the executioner. This boy, this trembling novice who held the axe like a piece of firewood, and she made her decision. She would not kneel. The chronicles tell us of a scene that defies the sanitized history of royalty we are often taught. Usually, we imagine the execution of a queen or a countess as a moment of solemn dignity. A prayer, a handkerchief dropped, a swift blow. But Margaret Pole was not going to give Henry VIII the satisfaction of a dignified death. She was innocent, and innocents do not offer their necks to the butcher. According to the darkest accounts of that day, when the officials tried to force her down, she stiffened her spine. Her grey hair, once tucked under headdresses of golden velvet, now blew in the wind. "So should traitors do," she declared, her voice cracking with age but burning with defiance. "And I am none." She refused to lay her head on the block. She turned her head away, looking towards the sky, towards God, towards anything but the axe. The executioner panicked. He was inexperienced, terrified by the rank of his victim and the defiance in her eyes. He didn't know how to handle a woman who fought back. He didn't wait for her to settle. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply swung. It was a clumsy, frantic blow, and it missed. The axe did not sever the neck. It crashed into her shoulder, slicing through the meat and shattering the bone. The sound must have been sickening, a wet, heavy crunch that echoed off the stone walls of the White Tower. Margaret screamed. It was not a scream of submission, but of shock and agony. She stumbled, bleeding profusely, her body broken but her spirit still refusing to yield. What followed was not an execution. It was a murder in broad daylight. The boy, horrified by his own incompetence and driven by panic, began to hack at her. He swung again and again. The records say he struck her 10 or 11 times. He chased her around the scaffold, striking at her head, her neck, her shoulders, anywhere the blade could land. It was a frenzy of violence, a chaotic butchery of an elderly grandmother who had once held the King of England in her arms as a baby. The witnesses stood frozen in horror. Even the constable of the tower, a man hardened by years of imprisonment and death, must have looked on with bile rising in his throat. This was not the king's justice. This was a crime against nature. Finally, after an eternity of pain, a lucky blow struck true. or perhaps she simply succumbed to the blood loss. Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, the last of the Plantagenets, fell silent. Her mangled body lay on the crimson-stained wood, a heap of rags and bone. The wretched and blundering youth stood over her, panting, his axe dripping, having completed the most shameful task in English history. They gathered her remains quickly. There was no lying in state. There was no grand funeral procession. They bundled her broken body into a chest and buried her inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower walls. She was laid to rest alongside her brother Edward, who had been murdered 40 years earlier. The family was finally reunited in the cold earth. When the news reached the king, he did not weep. He did not repent. He simply considered the matter closed. The threat was gone. The Plantagenet bloodline, which had terrified the Tudors for half a century, had been drained into the soil of the Tower Green. But Henry VIII made a miscalculation. You can kill a woman, but you cannot kill a martyr. When the news reached Rome, Reginald Pole, the son whose book had started this nightmare, was devastated. But amidst his grief, he found a terrible kind of pride. He told the Pope that he was now the son of a martyr. He declared that his mother's death was a sacrifice for the true faith. The Catholic Church agreed. She was not remembered as a traitor. She was remembered as Blessed Margaret Pole, a woman who died rather than bow to a tyrant. And what of Henry? The man who ordered her death died 6 years later. He died a rotting, obese ruin of a man, terrified of death, smelling of decay, leaving behind a kingdom divided and a child king who would die young. His dynasty, the Tudors, would last only a few more decades before dying out completely. Elizabeth would die childless, and the Tudor name would vanish just as Henry had feared. Margaret's bloodline, however, survived. Through her other descendants, her DNA flowed into the aristocracy of England. In a supreme irony, many of the noble families of Britain today trace their lineage back to the woman Henry tried to erase, not to Henry himself. But the most lingering legacy of Margaret Pole is not in the history books. It is in the atmosphere of the tower itself. Legend says that on the anniversary of her death, if you stand near the Tower Green where the scaffold once stood, you can still hear it. Not the wind, not the ravens, but a low, terrified scream. They say her ghost haunts the site, eternally reenacting those final, frantic moments. Some visitors claim to see the spectral figure of an old woman running, pursued by a shadow with an axe. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the story of Margaret Pole haunts us in a different way. It forces us to look at the brutality of power. It reminds us that behind the velvet robes and the golden crowns of the Tudor era lay a darkness that could devour an innocent woman simply because her last name was inconvenient. She was born a princess, lived as a pauper, rose to be a countess, and died a martyr. She was the white rose that the red rose could not crush, only cut down. The brutal, botched execution of Margaret Pole remains a stain on the conscience of England. It stands as the ultimate proof of Henry VIII's tyranny. He killed wives, he killed friends, he killed ministers, but in killing Margaret he killed the past. He tried to murder history itself, and yet 500 years later we are here, speaking her name. We remember her courage, we remember her defiance, and we remember the boy with the axe who proved once and for all that there is no glory in the death of the innocent, only horror. Thank you for watching this tragic chapter of history. It is a difficult story to tell and a difficult one to hear, but it is necessary. We must remember victims like Margaret Pole, lest we be blinded by the glamour of kings and queens. If this story moved you, if you felt the injustice of that morning in 1541, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps us bring these forgotten voices back to life. And before you go, I have a question for you. Do you think Margaret's refusal to kneel was an act of bravery, or was it a final moment of panic? Was she a warrior to the end, or just a terrified grandmother? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you have the stomach for it, click the video appearing on your screen now. It tells the story of another woman destroyed by Henry VIII, a queen whose heart was reportedly eaten by a dog. The Tudors were a dynasty of blood, and we are just scratching the surface. Click now and let's uncover the truth together.